Kalorama, a recorded books hybrid imprint, presents The Bitter End, the 2020 Presidential Campaign and the Challenge to American Democracy, by John Sides, Chris Tausanovitch, and Lynn Vavreck. Read by Knox. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and e-book formats of the book. 1. The storm is here. When do we start winning? That was what a friend of Ashley Babbitt's asked on Twitter the week before Congress met to certify the 2020 presidential election. Babbitt replied, January 6, 2021. Babbitt was a 35-year-old Air Force veteran who lived outside San Diego with her husband. She owned a struggling pool supply company. She also was an ardent supporter of Donald Trump and his crusade to overturn the results of the 2020 election. On January 5th, she had tweeted, "Nothing will stop us. They can try and try and try, but the storm is here, and it is descending upon D.C. in less than 24 hours. Dark to light." The next day, with a Trump flag tied around her neck, Babbitt joined a mob that breached the U.S. Capitol and interrupted the certification of the election. Babbitt had traveled to Washington to attend a Save America rally that Trump and his allies organized for that morning. At the rally, multiple people spoke in violent terms about what needed to happen. Representative Mo Brooks, a Republican from Alabama, said, "Today is the day American patriots start taking down names and kicking ass. Are you willing to do what it takes to fight for America?" One of Trump's sons, Donald Jr., said that red-blooded, patriotic Americans should fight for Trump. Trump advisor Rudy Giuliani called for trial by combat. At noon, Trump himself spoke for an hour, declaring that he would never concede the election, and telling supporters, "We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." He called on supporters to go to the Capitol and demand that Congress do the right thing. Thousands of his supporters heeded Trump's call. By 1 p.m., some breached the temporary fences on the Capitol grounds and clashed with Capitol police officers. A little after 2 p.m., protesters broke a window and began to enter the Capitol. At 2:30, the Senate, including Vice President Mike Pence and several members of his family, was evacuated. Protesters, including a few who were armed or carried zip-tie restraints, soon occupied the Senate chamber. Approximately 800 eventually entered the Capitol. The protest had become a riot, or, as some would later say, an insurrection. Babbitt was among a group that targeted the House chamber, where some members of Congress still remained, hiding under desks. The rioters attacked the glass doors that opened into the Speaker's lobby, a room just outside the chamber. One yelled, "Fuck the blue," at the officers standing there. The group hit the doors with their hands, flagpoles, and other objects. When one door broke, Babbitt tried to climb through. Michael Byrd, a Capitol police officer standing on the other side, shot her. Babbitt received medical attention on the scene from police and was transported to a local hospital, where she died of her injuries. Babbitt was the only rioter to be killed that day, but she was otherwise similar to the types of people who entered the Capitol. Most who were charged with a crime had no connection with far-right groups, militias, or white nationalist organizations, although such groups, including the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, were represented among the rioters. Court records showed that most of these people said they were only doing what Trump had told them to do, defend him and keep Biden from winning a stolen election. This was Babbitt's goal, too. Trump welcomed their efforts. Indeed, he had long been willing to downplay, countenance, or even encourage violence on his behalf. In his first presidential campaign, he praised supporters who assaulted protesters at his rallies, offering to pay their legal bills. In his second campaign, rather than disavowing the support of extremist groups, he encouraged them. In the presidential debate on September 29, 2020, he told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. And so it was no surprise that Trump was initially pleased when his supporters stormed the Capitol, according to White House officials who later spoke with reporters. The violence was well underway before Trump finally tweeted at 2:47 p.m., Please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the side of our country. Stay peaceful! ! Even then, one official said that Trump had not wanted to include "stay peaceful." Members of Congress and White House aides implored Trump to speak out more forcefully. Trump sent a second tweet at 3:25, calling for people to remain peaceful and saying, "No violence!" But he refused to condemn the violence outright or tell his supporters to leave the Capitol. At 4:22 p.m., he published a video message in which he said that we have to have peace and told his supporters to go home. But he also said that we love you, you're very special, and repeated his false claim of election fraud. At 6:25 p.m., after the rioters had finally been cleared from the Capitol, Trump praised them again, tweeting, "These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long." He added, "Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever." It was a jarring sentiment even at that point, and it would become more so when the full toll of that day was clear. Ashley Babbitt was dead. The Capitol building had been damaged extensively, and the Capitol Police had suffered devastating harm and loss. Approximately 140 officers were injured by rioters who beat them with baseball bats, flagpoles, and pipes. One officer, Brian Sicknick, died the following day of a stroke that was possibly linked to the injuries he had received when a rioter pepper-sprayed him. 4 officers committed suicide in the months following the riot. Beyond the toll on people and property was the cost to American democracy itself. A hallmark of democracies is the peaceful transfer of power after an election. That did not happen. Another hallmark is the willingness of election losers to consent to the outcome, thereby upholding the legitimacy of the system even as they regroup and seek to win next time. That did not happen either. Not only did Trump continue to insist that the election was stolen, but on the night of January 6th, he was joined by 8 Senate Republicans and 139 House Republicans, all of whom voted to object to the election results, when Congress reconvened only hours after members were forced to flee for their lives. The 2020 election and the attack on the Capitol were the culmination of a long year of casualties and crisis in the United States. There was the COVID-19 pandemic, which took the lives of over 350,000 Americans in 2020 alone, and put at least 14 million people out of work. And there were yet more deaths of African Americans at the hands of police officers, most notably the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin on May 25, 2020, which led to massive protests. The Trump White House saw its own series of crises, culminating in Trump's impeachment in early 2020 and then a second impeachment in early 2021 because of his actions and then inaction during the insurrection. These extraordinary events seemed initially as if they might transcend the powerful partisanship that usually characterizes American politics. Perhaps Americans would come together to beat a deadly virus. As one Washington Post columnist noted in February 2020, a global crisis could unite the planet and encourage everyone to pull together. Or perhaps they would be united by the gruesome spectacle of a police officer kneeling on the neck of a man for 9 minutes. As one headline after Floyd's murder put it, "Will this be the moment of reckoning on race that lasts?" But anything like unity or a reckoning proved fleeting at best. Political leaders stoked partisan divisions with predictable, even violent consequences. Thus, politics shaped how the central events of the election year played out, as much, if not more, than these events shaped politics. In turn, this had important consequences for the presidential election. For an incumbent like Trump, the combination of impeachment, a pandemic, and a recession seemed like a recipe for a landslide defeat. It was not. In the national popular vote, Biden's margin of victory was only about 2 points greater than Hillary Clinton's in 2016. In the key battleground states, the margins were even closer than in 2016. Of course, Trump still lost, and the attempts by his supporters and allies in Congress to overturn the election failed. Joseph R. Biden Jr. became the 46th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, Biden expressed his own hopes of unifying the country, saying, "We can join forces, stop the shouting, and lower the temperature. For without unity, there is no peace, only bitterness and fury. No progress, only exhausting outrage. No nation, only a state of chaos. This is our historic moment of crisis and challenge, and unity is the path forward." But how leaders responded to the events of 2020, and especially how Trump and his allies responded to the election and its aftermath, only exacerbated divisions that had been years in the making. Understanding those divisions helps explain why the election came to such a bitter end, and why this bitter end may only signal the beginning of a new democratic crisis in American politics. A calcified politics. That Americans are politically divided is obvious, but it is important to clarify what this means. Generalizations about a divided America do not tell us what issues are most divisive, when those divisions emerged, and whether we are deeply divided or merely closely divided. This makes it hard to say what has happened in American politics, what is causing it, and what it implies for the future. We seek to push beyond simple generalizations to identify the facts and trends that provide insight into the politics of the Trump presidency, the 2020 election, and the election's aftermath. Our argument centers on three elements. First, long-term tectonic shifts have pushed the parties apart while making the views within each party more uniform. This is the familiar trend toward gradually increasing partisan polarization. Second, shorter-term shocks, catalyzed especially by Trump, have sped up polarization on identity issues, those related to race, ethnicity, religion, and gender. And third, it is precisely these identity issues that voters in both parties care more about, exacerbating divisions even further and giving politicians every incentive to continue to play to them. The upshot is a more calcified politics. As it does in the body, calcification produces hardening and rigidity. People are more firmly in place and harder to move away from their predispositions. Growing calcification is a logical consequence of growing polarization, but the concepts are not identical. Polarization means more distance between voters in opposing parties in terms of their values, ideas, and views on policy. Calcification means less willingness to defect from their party, such as by breaking with their party's president or even voting for the opposite party. There is thus less chance for new and even dramatic events to change people's choices at the ballot box. New events tend to be absorbed into an axis of conflict in which identity plays the central role, and this means smaller fluctuations from year to year in election outcomes. But perhaps paradoxically, a more calcified politics does not produce the same winner year after year. This is because increasing partisan polarization has coincided with increasing partisan parity. In sheer numbers, Democrats and Republicans are more narrowly divided than they used to be, meaning that any movement in elections from one year to the next could change who governs the country. This combination of calcification and parity raises the stakes of politics and makes them more explosive. Tectonic shifts in partisan attitudes. Over the long term, the Democratic and Republican parties have become more internally homogeneous and more different from each other in political ideology, certain demographic characteristics, and certain policy issues. They have increasingly unfavorable views of each other too. It is worth unpacking this trend. First, the long term refers to a period that is measured in decades. This means that certain partisan divisions were visible at least by the 2000s and in many cases by the 1990s or even 1980s. Internally homogeneous means that each party is more consistently on one side of an issue. That is, Democrats are more consistently liberal and Republicans more consistently conservative. More distant means that, on average, Democrats and Republicans have become more different from each other or farther apart on some underlying ideological dimension. These changes are tectonic in the sense that they are slow-moving and, like the shifts of tectonic plates in the Earth's crust, accumulate to alter the landscape. These changes travel under different labels, such as partisan sorting or partisan polarization, but the upshot is the same: a growing alignment between people's party identification and certain demographic attributes and political views. For example, political science research and public opinion data shows that Democrats and Republicans increasingly diverge in their self-described political ideology. Between 1994 and 2020, the percentage of Democrats who called themselves liberal increased from 25% to 51%, and the percentage of Republicans who called themselves conservative increased from 58% to 75%, although substantial fractions of both parties still call themselves moderates. As of 2020, 35% of Democrats and 20% of Republicans. Moreover, Democrats and Republicans increasingly differ demographically, including by gender, race, and religiosity. For example, compared to earlier periods of time, men have become less likely and women more likely to identify with the Democratic Party. African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans have also become more likely to identify with the Democratic Party. And, especially among white Americans, religiously observant people and evangelical Protestants, not mutually exclusive groups to be sure, have become more likely to identify as Republican. The exact magnitude and timing of these trends differs. For instance, the shifts among African Americans were larger and occurred much earlier than shifts among Hispanic Americans. Democrats and Republicans increasingly diverge on many political issues too. Between 1972 and 2016, for example, Democrats and Republicans came to take more distinctive positions on the role of government in the economy, visible in issues including the overall size of government, whether it should spend more or less on various policy areas, and whether it should play a larger role in regulating economic markets, such as by guaranteeing people jobs or providing health care or health insurance. Polarization on these issues has been driven primarily by growing conservatism in the Republican Party. The parties have also diverged on non-economic issues. The most obvious one is abortion, with Democrats shifting to the left and Republicans to the right. These various and growing partisan differences are related, unsurprisingly. One's self-described ideology and views on policy issues are not synonymous. Not every person who identifies as conservative favors cuts to government spending, for example. But it makes sense that they both exhibit partisan polarization. Polarization by demography and ideology are also linked. The gender gap in party identification has grown because men and women have different views of certain policies. The parties have polarized around those same policies, and thus men and women now differ more in their partisan loyalties. But this pattern of polarization or sorting does not characterize everything. Catholicism used to be more strongly correlated with party when Catholics were a linchpin of the Democratic-leaning New Deal coalition. Now, Catholics are evenly split between the parties. Partisan polarization in the public has been led by polarization among politicians and activists. In the first half of the 20th century, both political parties had an ideologically diverse mix of elected officials and interest group leaders. The Democratic Party had its northern liberals and its southern conservatives. The GOP had its Goldwater conservatives and its liberal Rockefeller Republicans. As time went on, conservative Southern Democrats were replaced by Republicans. Ronald Reagan's support of tax cuts and deregulation and opposition to abortion helped to position the GOP more firmly as a party of the right. As leaders became more ideologically similar within each party, many rank-and-file partisans did too, especially people attentive enough to politics to know where leaders stood. However, because many people are not political junkies, party polarization among citizens has always been more modest than among political leaders. Many ordinary voters continue to have at least some views that are out of step with the reigning ideas in their party. Nevertheless, partisan polarization is meaningful, and crucially, it is visible to Americans. When asked, "Do you think there are any important differences in what the Republicans and Democrats stand for?" Americans increasingly say yes. In 1952, only 50% did. By 1984, it was 62%. By 2004, it was 76%, and in 2020, it was 90%. These trends were apparent among men and women, different racial and ethnic groups, both Democrats and Republicans, and so on. In other words, the trend in perceptions of the parties is not due to changes in the demographic composition of the American public, such as its growing racial and ethnic diversity. It is more the result of changes in the parties themselves. As a result, the vast majority of Americans, as well as all kinds of Americans, now reject the old George Wallace quote that there is not a dime's worth of difference between the two major parties. An increasing percentage of voters can place the two parties on the liberal-conservative spectrum with basic accuracy, meaning they place the Democrats to the left of the Republicans. Moreover, voters tend to see an increasing distance between the parties on various issues, and especially to see the opposing party as more distant from their preferred party. As the parties have polarized and as people have perceived those differences, they have also come to feel differently about the two parties. Thus, partisan divides are not only about substantive political issues, more taxes or fewer taxes, say, but about whether the other party and those who support it are fundamentally good or bad. In a 2019 Pew Research Center survey, substantial fractions of Democrats and Republicans said that members of the other party are more closed-minded, unintelligent, immoral, or unpatriotic than other Americans. For example, 55% of Republicans said that Democrats were more immoral than other Americans, and 47% of Democrats said this of Republicans. This dislike of the opposing party has become more prevalent over the past decades, a phenomenon known as affective polarization or negative partisanship. The trend only continued into 2020. In particular, when asked to evaluate the two parties on a 0 to 100 scale, where 100 indicates the most positive feelings, Americans increasingly rate the opposing party unfavorably, that is, below 50. Data from American National Election Study, ANES, surveys shows this trend since the question was introduced in 1978. Between 1978 and 2016, the average rating of the opposing party declined from 48 to 31, while the average rating of a person's own party was largely stable. In online surveys conducted by the ANES since 2012, including in 2020 when the pandemic prevented face-to-face interviewing, unfavorable feelings were even more prevalent, in part because people appear to feel more comfortable expressing negative opinions when they are not being interviewed by another person. In 2012, the average rating of the opposing party among online respondents was 25. In 2020, it was 19. And because views of respondents' own party rebounded, 2020 saw a record level of affective polarization. These trends in polarization are significant enough on their own, but they take on even greater significance in the minds of ordinary Americans, whose perceptions of the parties are often exaggerated and stereotyped. For example, Americans see the parties as farther apart on issues than they really are, as well as more demographically distinct from each other. Republicans think that almost half of Democrats are black, about twice the real number. Democrats think that about 45% of Republicans are very wealthy, making $250,000 or more a year. The true number is more like 2%. Partisans also exaggerate the extent of affective polarization itself. They think the other party feels more prejudice against their own party than is really true. One reason for these rampant misperceptions seems to be that Americans' mental picture of the political parties includes mainly party leaders, activists, and ideologues. That is, the type of partisans who are most likely to illustrate the pattern of polarization. These trends in polarization have important implications for elections. One is higher levels of partisanship in presidential approval and voting behavior. Most partisans approve of their own party's president, but disapprove of the opposing party's president. Similarly, most partisans vote for their party's candidates up and down the ballot. Presidential candidates typically win 90% or more of their party's voters. And split-ticket voting, such as voting for the Republican presidential candidate and the Democratic congressional candidate, is in decline. A second and related implication is the weakening power of other factors that have traditionally affected evaluations of presidents and voting in presidential elections. Most important is the state of the national economy. In the past, incumbent presidents benefited from economic growth and suffered from economic downturns. But strong partisanship has weakened the relationship between the economy and presidential approval, in part because people are loath to give the opposing party's president credit for a growing economy or to punish their own party's president when the economy goes south. Similarly, a more polarized political environment may make presidential election outcomes less sensitive to changes in the economy because so many partisans are unwilling to support the opposing party's candidate under any circumstances. In short, recent election outcomes seem to depend less on achieving shared goals, like peace and prosperity, and more on the clashing views increasingly visible in party politics. A third implication is that there are smaller shifts in presidential election outcomes from year to year. If factors like the economy do not affect presidential approval or elections as much, and if partisan loyalty is strong, then one year's election outcome is not likely to differ much from the previous outcome. But smaller shifts do not mean no shifts, and even small shifts can be consequential given partisan parity. In the 1952 ANES survey, 59% of Americans identified with or leaned toward the Democratic Party, but only 36% identified with or leaned toward the Republican Party, a Democratic advantage of 23 points. But this advantage declined over the years, and by 2016, it was only 7 points, 46% versus 39%. This parity is visible not just at the national level, but also in crucial battleground states. In 2016, the outcomes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin were all decided by less than 1 percentage point. This increasing party parity matters all the more because American elections tend to use winner-take-all rules. A narrow win gets you 4 years in the White House or a House or Senate seat, but a narrow loss gets you nothing. It makes sense, then, that these long-term changes are crucial to explaining the dramatic events of 2020 and the violent aftermath of a narrowly decided election. Sudden shocks in identity politics. Over the short term, years, not decades, the Democratic and Republican parties have rapidly divided on issues related to identity, especially race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, and gender. Of course, some party divisions on these issues were apparent years ago, but recently there has been a sharp increase in the magnitude of these divisions. If the process of partisan sorting or polarization was tectonic, like the slow creep of the Earth's crust, the pace of partisan polarization on identity-inflected issues more resembles the shocks of an earthquake. These shocks stem directly from the identity, rhetoric, and decisions of political leaders and how the public has reacted to them. A central part of this story is Trump himself. One example of an identity shock concerned immigration. Since 1965, Gallup has asked Americans, in your view, should immigration be kept at its present level, increased, or decreased? From 1965 to 1993, restrictive views became increasingly common as more and more Americans wanted to decrease immigration. Since the mid-1990s, restrictive views have receded overall, although there have been occasional spikes in the percent who favored decreasing immigration, such as after the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. More notable, though, is the pattern of partisan polarization. Early on, there was almost none. In the 1965 poll, which was conducted right before Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, The views held by Democrats and Republicans were almost identical. That matched the signals that party leaders were sending.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?